insurance fraud.
And let's just kill those 1,500 people. Nobody will notice. Fuck, let's save that fucking Molly Brown and the rest of them.
There's a great book, if anyone wants to read it, called The House of Morgan by Ron Chernow, who's probably best known for Alexander Hamilton, which is a great book. But House of Morgan, if anyone wants to know more about J.P. Morgan.
I'm sure there's people clamoring now to the books.
It's a great book. It's a great book. It's a great book.
Well, I've always wanted to know more about Mr. Morgan. Brian has written this tickled me. I've wanted to bring this up. Greetings. He puts me over for a paragraph. I'm too modest. Anyway, I was watching the match between the Midnight and the Rock and Roll at Wrestle War 90 the other day, and besides being a great match, the commentary had me laughing out loud. It was a valiant effort by the Funker on color, but more than anything, JR's descriptions of you throughout the match were the kind of quotes that should be framed on a wall somewhere. The Prince of Polyester voted most humble at Mrs. Finster's finishing school for nice boys. The only mixed doubles tennis champion whose partner was a man or something along those lines. While I have heard JR call you that and so much more over the years, it got me thinking, were you coming up with those descriptions of yourself during long car rides and feeding them to commentators before the matches? Or were JR and others coming up with that kind of stuff to get your persona over even more? Blah, blah, blah. Even though I hated you, you're great. Thanks for everything.
Great question.
And actually, no, that was JR. And and also he was selling that match with the Midnight and the Rock and Roll at Wrestle War because the Rock and Roll had just come back. He knew that the Midnight had been getting jacked around and fucked around under Jim Herd, and that we were going to have a, standout match, and he was up for calling it, and he was trying to put more heat on me at the same time. So the Prince of Polyester was his. I remember when he first said, I don't know if it's the first time he said that, but he said it with Bob Caudle, I think the first time, voted most humble at Mrs. Finster's finishing school for nice boys. The mixed doubles tennis champion, that was a line that I came up with to explain the tennis racket in Louisiana, and he had remembered it from Mid-South TV.
Oh, wow.
Where it was a throwaway thing where I said, I'll have you know that I'm just as much of an athlete as my men, the Midnight Express, Jim Ross. Why, for example, I was one half of the mixed doubles tennis champions at my country club back home, and my partner, he was even happier about it than I was. And and for the people who got it, it worked, and for the people who got it in another way, it worked, and for the people who didn't get it at all, it didn't hold anything up. But he remembered that all those years later and dropped that in. But that's the thing, JR. But all the announcers then, they had a format which listed the matches and time and sometimes who was coming out first and where you were pitching and if you were coming out of a VTR or whatever. There was no – JR would prepare. He was very professional. That's where I learned to do my commentary notes, where he would sit down with the format and he would write down notes with his color guy that they needed to talk about, whether it was things that had happened to somebody in the match or things that had happened between the guys in the match and previously to, why the rivalry was going on, what they were pointed to, big events coming up we might drop in a plug for, whatever. And we would all write that down pretty much for ourselves. But no, the announcers had the freedom to do what they did, which was announce. And that was part of getting me over by burying me. If the announcer, whether it's Bob Caudle or Lance Russell or Jim Ross that you like and respect, is knocking this guy, then, but he's not saying I'm a shitty manager. He would, even when I was a heel, he would say, some people say he's the best manager of modern times, but he didn't have to make me macho or admirable or have all these wonderful traits that made me a babyface. Maybe I was the best at what I did because I cheated and lied and fucking yelled at people, which is what I did.
Were you happy with the referee spot in that match at Wrestle War with you and Nick Patrick?
Well, yeah, we called it on the fly. I just said, fuck it, right? Because we were doing all the other shit, and I'd never done it with Nick before.
Really?
Well, I don't think maybe we had done it on a spot show, or maybe we did it a few times after that because he had fun and liked doing it. But with Tommy Young, it was, and I'm not knocking Nick Patrick, but with Tommy Young, it was bliss, right? Because Nick he was a big, good-sized guy and had been a wrestler. With Tommy Young, the Felix Unger of wrestling, who had a personality that just shone through, and all the Mid-Atlantic fans who had been used to him. It was great because he was a little prissy in the way that he conducted himself in the ring, like dusting off the turnbuckles and shit. So when I'm pulling my fucking tie off and throw my jacket down, and then he starts grabbing his fucking shirt and pulling it out and putting the fists up, it was great. With Nick, I don't know if I'd have really done that because he was big enough to kick my ass, but also he wasn't really. So he was like, okay, here we go. I think you can see Ricky and Robert going over and Iggying him, like, pull your shirt tail out and put your fists up. You know, we used to call shit. The Rock and Roll knew what I was doing because we had done it with various referees. I'd done it at that point, with Pee Wee Anderson also, I think, because Pee Wee, it was great because he was fucking 5'4" and 130 pounds, and I would still back up from him. But anyway, the Rock and Roll knew what we were going to do, and obviously the Midnight knew. And I just said, "Fuck it, let's get him over here." That was so, but it was more fun doing it with Tommy Young, who just had the funniest expressions on his face. Nick was kind of like, I don't know whether they're going to fire me for doing this or not, you know.
We're talking about Nick Patrick, and it made me think of The Assassin. Did you hear this? I mean, it's from 1984, but it's just been going around the last few days. This Angelo Mosca Jr. interview that everyone's been posting.
I have not listened to that, but I've actually heard a few first go round when he was in the business in 81 or whatever. So I'm not really, it's not on my must see list.
Can I play you a few seconds of this and see if you can find what's wrong?
Okay, go ahead.
And right here with me, another family of wrestling, as Angelo Mosca Jr. is here with us. And
that's Johnny Weaver.
He's upset, and no wonder he should be, because I know he doesn't like to stick his nose in other people's business, but he had to make it his business. Jones and the Assassin are just running it's roughshod over everybody.
It's just not him. It's a lot of things going on here. There's a thing called rules, a book that's written, something that people should go by. But here it seems that book's been put aside, not just with Jody, the man in the mask, and everyone.
The man in the mask.
Got to abide by rules.
Yeah, right there. He says his real name on TV.
He just said the name of the dreaded masked assassin. The first name is Jody. Holy God. Yeah, that was a real pip. He was. But anyway, no, in answer to the question, no, the announcers just, a lot of times as the wrestlers were calling shit on the fly based on what was getting over with people, the announcers were kind of describing it and trying to do their best to get those guys' personalities over. And of course, and we just talked about a comedy spot, funny in wrestling, that I'm supposed to, I hate fun. I don't like fun. There was a spot meant to embarrass the heel manager with the referee and provide a little entertainment with nobody breaking the fourth wall and admitting that we were not in the act of doing something that we weren't supposed to be doing.
And the crowd was into it. John Hitchcock at ringside was into it.
That's all you can ask for Hitchcock to be into it.
That's right.
Hold on. This one's a good one. Bret Hart said, this is from Brad. Brad. His other name there was a little obscene. Anyway, Bret Hart said in his book that once a wrestler is seen as a jobber, it becomes a stink that's impossible to wash off. As a former promoter yourself, do you think you could have taken guys like the Brooklyn Brawler or Barry Horowitz and turned them into upper mid-card or main event guys? Is it really impossible to wash the jobber stink off, quote unquote, or is it just bookers being unwilling to see them in any other way? Thanks in advance.
It ain't the bookers.
Well, no. Here's the thing. I like Steve Lombardi, Brooklyn Brawler. He actually, in the days of the territories when you had 25 different wrestling areas that needed a steady stream of main event guys, he was a good enough worker and burly enough in his younger days that if he'd had a manager, and probably in a small southern territory like Montgomery, Alabama, where they sent Lawler to learn, and if he had a manager that could talk about how fucking New York he was, and then he could just use his accent a little bit, and you gimmicked it up a little bit, work-wise, yes. But Steve was not going to be a main event talent, I don't think, in a major territory under that name or any others. Barry Horowitz was a very good-looking athlete and good-looking guy and a good performer. But not only did he not necessarily have the size that was necessary to be taken as a main event top guy, but also I don't know that I would have taken Barry Horowitz as a main event guy when I heard him speak. And talk. He was a good performer and he was a solid guy on the card. And he did have a few gimmicks where in the territories at the tail end of them, he was used in spots, but just not to be the top guy in the territory. But just he was not one of the overall, now with only 2 or 3 places, one of the overall 40 or 50 best guys in his field in the business, right? And that's no disrespect. Here's the thing Brett was talking about, and from Brett's perspective of his book, it became obvious, and I didn't really know this. Brett followed Stampede Wrestling when he was in Stampede, and he followed the WWF when he went there. And I don't even think he ever saw fucking Ric Flair wrestle, till the late 80s or what. He admitted this. So he was used to seeing those guys presented where they were. And that's, that's pretty much how they were used. The problem now is everybody is like Bret Hart. They only see 1 or 2 kinds of wrestling because that's all there is to see. So whereas in the 70s, if Barry Horowitz had been beaten like a drum, turned into powder, and ridden out of town in a fucking bucket on a fucking railroad car in 3 or 4 different territories, he still had 15 other places he could go, whereas if they wanted to use him and felt like he deserved a spot, then he could have one because he was a good worker, especially for, underneath matches. But because and the fans there in those places would have bought him at first if they used him in those spots because they hadn't seen the other territories' TV where he was decimated and prison raped, right? So, yeah, you could easily do that if a guy was good and if he had it to make it in at least a good small territory, he would at some point main event in his life. Other times, guys were just underneath. But now, once you've been seen as a guy that everybody beats the fuck out of on especially WWF television for any length of time, or on any of the alternatives, the Ring of Honor that are growing up, if the worst thing could be a losing streak on Ring of Honor TV, because then you can't win on the secondary television for a long period of time, and that's where people see you as a job guy.
What about traditionally, like guys in the 80s, like, you brought up Barry Horowitz and Steve Lombardi. Those are both guys. They tried to repackage Steve Lombardi. That's when they created the Brooklyn Brawler, and they didn't really do much with it, and it didn't really take beyond being a jobber with a gimmick. But guys like Paul Roma and Jim Powers, who had the physiques that they like, and they tried it with Roma, and I'm a fan of Roma. I actually think, unfortunately, he's a great example of that stink following him to WCW. He shouldn't have been a horseman, but also I think I don't know if I don't remember if I've met him. It's been more recently at a fan fest, so I don't have a dog in the fight. I don't know the guy either way. Don't dislike him or like him, but I think mentally he probably wasn't ready for it either, and may never have realized, because I think didn't he once do a promo saying, "I was just as good as the others," or whatever the fuck. I don't know, but. If you've been seen on everybody's television getting the shit kicked out of you on a regular basis for long enough that they perceive you as a job guy, then the only thing that you can do is go away and come back looking completely different to the point where they don't remember it's you. But now, thanks to the internet, nobody can do that. Larry Latham was a fucking main event heel. You could obviously tell he was from down in the country by the way he spoke, but he spoke perfect English when he was a member of the Blonde Bombers. But 3 years later, when he came back to Tennessee and he had gained literally 75 pounds and grown his hair out and the beard and looked like a moondog, only the girls that came every week really knew that was the fucking Blonde Bomber. You have to change your look. You have to get a new gimmick. You have to do something completely different, and you have to be gone for long enough that they've forgotten the smell of you. You can't just – that was why that one time the infamous TNA debacle, when I had to come out and tell them, no, you're not going to have fucking Eric Young take a baseball bat and lay Sting and fucking Hernandez out, both, and cut a promo standing over the top of them.
your fucking main event guys for the next pay-per-view when this guy that you've just put in a suit 2 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago was